This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. Obviously, I like to have conversations. I do a lot of interviews. It's a give, it's a take. I ask, they answer. Today is a little bit different. Far less answers to my questions than you will typically hear on this podcast. And that's okay. It's every guest's right to handle how they want to handle their situation. Today, we jump into a topic a little controversial: long-term poverty in America. Now, of course, that's going to bring up many tangential issues right away: crime, education, the way society deals with each other. Is it merit? Or is there a guiding hand, a guiding subjective hand that has nothing to do with fairness? All of these issues today I discuss with my guest, Luke Shaefer, his book, Injustice of Place. Now, of course, many people are going to take by that title something. They're going to infer something. That's okay. You can do that. You can read the book. You can listen to this conversation. But I will give the warning. This was a tough conversation. Tough for me. I get to select my guests, and I selected my guest today. And it was overall a fine conversation. Fine enough. But it's the political dodges that really frustrate me. Look, now for those of you that have listened to this podcast for a long time, you're going to immediately see that when issues come up about the stock market or unemployment or inflation, you're going to see the disagreement between the two of us quite clearly. I don't have any rose-colored glasses on. I don't think the U.S. Fed has done such a great job going all the way back to the mid-90s. It's been big bubble, and perhaps we're in the middle of another big bubble right now. We don't know. We'll have to wait and see, but all the signs point to, as we all know. So that's my little warning as you jump into this conversation. I'm sure some people will agree with me, and some people will disagree with me. Hey, at least it's still America. At least we can still talk for the moment. Who knows if that will be a right in the future, but it is for right now. No further pontificating from me, no further speech from me. Let's jump right into my conversation with Luke Shaefer and discuss the injustice of place. In advance of this conversation, I started thinking to myself, what's a good place to start? One of those nice, semi-controversial statements. I don't know if it's so controversial looking back in hindsight now, but if we look back to the late 60s and we look at the Great Society, we look at LBJ, we have this desire at the moment in time to solve many things, whether it's poverty, education, crime, racism. Many issues were looking to be solved. So here we are now in 2023. Is it a fair opinion for someone to say that even if there were good intentions back in the late 60s, and some people might argue there were not, let's say there were good intentions, that here we are in 2023 and what we did and how we did it and how everything has unfolded since that point in time is a failure? Is that a fair point of view for someone to have?
As you mentioned, we did a lot of things in the 1960s. It was really the first time we decided to tackle poverty in particular. Some of that had to do with public programs like Medicare. I think a lot of people would think that Medicare has been successful. It's not a perfect program. We went from having seniors who had no health insurance entitlement to seniors being covered. And I think that's been a great success. We've seen huge increases in span of life. Medicaid is also a program that has been successful. We can actually chart some of the programs, food assistance, now called SNAP. We can see as it rolls out across the country that decades later, kids are doing better in adulthood. They're healthier. They work more. Lots of different things improve. A lot has changed since then. You're absolutely right. The biggest thing that's changed is the economy. You can imagine going back to the 1960s, we were having this year over year growth. It was really an incredibly anomalous time. The mistake I think we made was thinking that was the way it was going to be, that we were just going to see growth year over year, that manufacturing was going to be the base of our economy. Of course, that didn't prove to be true. In fact, that was the period that was anomalous. So much of what we think society should be like somehow goes back to that period. Manufacturing's been in huge decline. We've seen time and time again those types of jobs go to different parts of the world. We've seen the earnings, especially lower educated men, decline, and that's been incredibly tough. Lots of societal changes at the same time. My reading of the evidence is that a lot of what we did in the War on Poverty and the Great Society actually worked, and we're quite a bit better off as a result, but that it's been against the tide of these huge structural challenges, which have nothing to do with those programs. I think have left Americans in a place of thinking like, why isn't it like that anomaly? Why isn't the economy working? Why aren't there jobs that if I get through high school and I work hard, I can have a safe and secure income and I can have a safe and secure retirement? That's a lot to ask some social safety net programs to work against.
I happen to be in a country that has no social safety net. I think one of the reasons I love being here is because of that. And I think what it does to society is it creates a little more hustle. Now, of course, it's nicer to have that social safety net. It's nicer to be able to help people if they are in need. Do you think, though, that with our social programs, and for example, if we look at some of the areas of the country that you write about, if we look at some of our big cities right now, if we look at just basic things like crime and cleanliness, it doesn't make sense to me. Look, there's a lot of poor places in this world. Some places look ragtag and some places don't. I don't understand, especially in the last 4, 5, 6 years, what has been happening in terms of, it's like almost people are just giving up in terms of their communities, the look and feel, the crime. You must feel this as well.
Actually, the evidence is pretty clear that you're wrong on all of that. Not wrong in some of it.
The crime I'm wrong on?
Yeah, let's talk about crime. But let me get to crime. The first thing is work. There's more Americans working now than ever before. We just had an incredibly historic return to work after the COVID recession. We've never bounced back from an economy like that. And the reason why a lot of employers feel like they can't find workers is because workers are so in demand. They're just asking for more workers than we've ever had. It's kind of like if you were to run the fastest race you've ever run. Let's say you beat your race time by 6 minutes or something, and somebody says, well, you really should have beat it by 12 minutes. You're not really measuring up. Black unemployment is at the lowest level ever. We've got people returning to the workforce. We recovered 20 million jobs in just a short amount of time. That's not anything like we've ever done before.
We did do the COVID lockdowns. We did do all kinds of things with the Fed in terms of creating additional money. It's not necessarily a surprise that after lockdowns, there's going to be a big jump up in people going back to work, right? I mean, that's fair.
Yeah, it sounds like you and I are in agreement is that a strong social safety net is the way to do it. That money injected into the economy is exactly what brought us back. So I'm glad we're in agreement.
Hold on. We also have seen record inflation, which has caused rates to jump up.
Not record inflation, not even remotely record inflation. If you're going to try to use facts, be accurate. We've had moderate inflation.
It was up near 10% for a while. It's around 5% now.
5% now is almost the regular rate, is almost what we would expect to be. We were in a period of very, very low inflation for a while.
If the Fed was not concerned about inflation, we would not have rates at 5%.
Well, that's what the Fed is for.
Right, but that's the scary part.
That's what the Fed is for. A lot of people think they should have moved a little bit faster. So are you upset that the Fed did its job?
No, hold on. If we look back at 07, 08, 09, also, we could see a situation where there was really low unemployment before the Fed had to start raising rates to pierce a bubble. We can't necessarily look at these things as brief points in time.
I'm perplexed by your answer, though, because it took us years and years and tons of hardship to get the jobs back from that recession. This is a recession where we had some modest inflation, and inflation sucks. Everybody knows that. The Fed probably should have acted a little bit earlier. We have more Americans to work now than we've ever had before in a short amount of time. We also have had years where we had almost no inflation. If we want to go back to the periods of Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan and high, persistent, longer term inflation, that's a terrible idea. I think the social safety net, where, as you said, we brought money into the economy, we put it into people's pockets, poverty plummeted to all-time lows, credit scores are at their best ever, people have more give in their bank balances.
Inflation is coming from the Fed. Because if we want to start picking apart presidents, all of the presidents just happen to have been there when certain things have happened, generally.
I think that's what people say when you criticize the president. They like, I don't disagree. We have had modest inflation during a period where we've had huge growth. And you seem to say, though, the Fed should have done something, or the Fed shouldn't have done something.
I want to make sure we have a consistent back and forth here. I don't want to give you a speech. I don't want you to give me a speech. If we look back at the dot-com era, if we look back at the Great Recession, we can see situations where the Fed would raise rates. Then we saw what happened to markets. Ultimately, for example, right now, would it surprise you? Would it surprise me with the way that the Fed has raised rates? Will we expect, if they keep rates high based on the last 25 years of Fed actions, would we expect U.S. stocks to stay high? Probably not. And if U.S. stocks don't stay high, would we expect record unemployment? Probably not. So my point is, we're at a moment in time and we got to see what's going to happen. I mean, it could go the way you're talking about. My gut level feel, based on the last 25 years, that once the Fed starts raising rates, it's kind of all bets off when it comes to the markets, especially stocks. Because, people say, well, hold on, if I can get 5% putting my money in a Marty market account, why am I going to go deal with the stock market? That's an issue, isn't it?
We're a long way off from poverty. I'll just say this. I think, as you and I both agree, the Fed's role is to raise rates to tamp down inflation. They've done that and inflation's come down. No man knows the future, so we'll see what happens next. I think we're in a pretty good place. I think the stock market was overinflated for a long time for exactly the reason you say, is that interest rates were very, very low. So people were putting more of their money in the stock market. I do think in retrospect, the Fed should have moved a little bit faster. All those people who are working, I thought we were talking about nobody's working, they've given up. At least let's celebrate the point. More Americans are working now than ever before. Unemployment among Black Americans is at the lowest level ever, just as one data point. And the stock market's in pretty good shape.
When we have interest rates at zero for a decade, that causes imbalances.
I totally agree. Absolutely. We shouldn't have done that. Let's celebrate this moment of agreement, shall we?
Okay, there we go.
Do you want to talk about violence now?
Yeah, I want to bring up crime. Crime is something to me that seems like has become political, very political in America. Whereas if I go ahead and I pull up something like FBI crime stats, or I look at various cities or whatnot, it seems like it's pretty straightforward. Like, okay, here are the numbers. This is coming from the government. It seems like pretty straightforward. It doesn't seem like we have that conversation in America, do we?
Well, it's interesting. We had about 2 decades of massive declines in crime. That was a remarkable success. If you and I had been talking a couple of years ago, I think we could have agreed that whatever America was doing was incredibly right. Then we had COVID. I think COVID's really impacted a lot of people. Part of COVID was that people bought guns at a massive rate, a rate that we've never seen. We now have more guns than active cell phones in the United States, more guns than cars, more guns than TVs.
What does that mean?
You can see a massive correlation. If you want to look at the state that has the most murder by guns, I think it's Idaho. Now, I don't think there's anything wrong with people in Idaho. We can problematize them. I think the problem is guns. I'm not saying that's the only problem, but if you're in a knife fight, it's a whole different thing than guns. And they're just so available that it's able to take this moment where people have a lot of anger and frustration about things that are happening in the world, make it a much worse situation for us than it was.
Gun violence, gun death in America, though, is not equally distributed across all populations.
It's true. When we look at states, Idaho has got the highest gun rates. It's not surprising that cities also have more trouble because there's more people in them. Interestingly, actually, when you look per capita, rural areas tend to have more violence per capita, and that's not equally distributed too. There's whole swaths of the country where that's not true. part of what we see is because there are more people in cities.
Okay, if I look at the FBI crime statistics by race, I look at Black, white, Asian, what am I supposed to take from that information? That it's only about population density? Is that what I'm supposed to take? Just to take a step back, I'm not trying to be confrontational here. I feel like America's got this, you know this, the way that you're laying out issues, half of America is going to call you a name and half America is going to love you. And probably the same for me.
I don't know. Not sure about that. I'm calling the balls and the strikes. If you want to talk about violence, America also has an incredibly long history of violence. We have a history also of clustering people of color into small segments of cities. We have a long history of redlining. We have a long history of not distributing opportunity equally. And then you throw 400 million guns into the mix. Nothing in the data seems surprising to me.
You have a lot to unpack there. A very small percentage of the American population commits about 60% of gun homicides. That's a fair statement, right?
That I don't know. I would have to look at the data.
Okay, if I said 50%, it is 60% now, but if I said 50%,
okay, we can take it.
You wouldn't have to look at the data if I said 50%. This is where I think if we can make any progress in a conversation today, trust me, as a guy, a Gen X guy, to say this, to put the numbers on the table, it literally causes half of America to go, yeah, that's a good point, Mike. And the other half of America is under their breath calling me names. Why is that?
I think that there's the fact that a lot of people come to the data already decided on what they think is true. I would call it positive confirmation bias. If I understand what you're alluding to, I think you might call it racism. You have to put everything into historical context, and you have to put it into the context of where we are. Talk about a place. Let's imagine a place. Let's imagine somebody takes a set of people and says, you can't live here, you can't live here, you can only live here. You can't have this opportunity, you can't have that opportunity. It creates long-term structural differences, wealth. And then you throw in the most dangerous things that you could possibly have. That creates correlations in the data. I have a new paper that tries to predict gun violence using rates of mobility. That's structural rates of mobility. We have places in the United States where it's just as easy to rise to the middle class as if you're poor as it is if you're middle class. We have places in the United States where you can't possibly rise to the middle class. If we use those rates of mobility to predict violence, we can predict county violence, gun violence, deaths by interpersonal violence to a huge degree. And it wipes away all of these other correlations that you're talking about. This is our problem. We created this problem in the United States. As you said, America is public.
But you and I didn't create it, right?
Our grandfathers, our great-grandfathers created these problems. Absolutely. They're a part of our legacy.
But I'm saying, though, in terms of me and you, or a 20-year-old in America in college today, they didn't create these problems. Fair point?
Part of the book, which we haven't talked about at all, is trying to understand that you can't take what's happening in society right now out of the context of what's happened for generations. You did not directly contribute. I don't know anything about you, so maybe you did or maybe you didn't. Let's pretend that you didn't. You are part of a society that has for centuries done things to keep people down. You know what's a big thing that we've done to keep people down is kill them. We have lynchings all over the South. You know what's an incredibly good predictor of the poverty rate of someone today is how many people were lynched in that county over 100 years ago. We've enslaved people. Interestingly, some of the plantation owners that we write about in the book then went down to South Texas, created the migratory patterns of labor. We cannot take ourselves out of this history. It's something that we have to acknowledge. Understand, if this is a unique problem for the United States, maybe it's not the fault of one set of people who have had the worst deal for the longest time.
As I mentioned earlier, I'm in a Asian country, pretty homogenous place. My next door neighbors are pretty homogenous. China, Japan, Korea, etc., Thailand. That has struck me being in Asia over the years. It's also struck me that America keeps the focus only on the past, whereas I will see and I will experience, whether firsthand or stories, of Asian immigrants to America showing up with zero, except maybe some hustle gene, and succeeding. You and I both know across the top universities in America, if there were not, and there's the one case before Harvard right now, if there were not policies that really didn't deal with merit directly, that Asian students would probably dominate most of our best universities. They'd be the ones, if you gave them all the tests and said, here, go take the test, they'd kick my butt, they'd kick everybody's butt, really, overall. That's the part that strikes me, is that sometimes I feel like America gets caught. And fair enough, you have done the work, you've put down the historical legacy. I commend you.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
I sometimes feel like, we might not necessarily agree with everything, but I sometimes feel like, how do we get out of it if we're stuck in it constantly? And then on the flip side, I can look over here and I can see this other group of people that might come from where I'm at right now, and they might come to America, and then all of a sudden, they're just dominating in terms of, for example, getting into Harvard. I mean, Asian kids, it's just through the roof. This is the part that I struggle with, because America does everything. We started the conversation with going back to LBJ. America has spent a lot of money, a lot of time. We don't seem to make progress on many of the issues that you bring up. Ultimately, I think that means that you would probably say, well, and that's why I brought up the LBJ question to begin with, is that then we need to do more. When I hear that we need to do more, then I think, well, okay, that's going to mean more money into government, bigger government. Then I'm going to say to myself, well, hold on, isn't this the same group, the same people that have been in control and in power, whether at the federal, state, or local level for decades? Then if we look at things like crime stats or education stats, which connect very well with poverty, do you see my frustration?
I guess I would return to my first answer, which is a lot of what we do really, really helps. I agree that we're not in a good place. We don't do a good job of celebrating the successes that we have. We've had a massive restructuring of our economy over the last few decades. That means that things that were true, that we took it for granted in our society, that people could find stable jobs, they're not true today. We have a particular kind of capitalism, which pays very, very low wage jobs, which has a lot of focus on shareholder interest. And we haven't done as much at all to protect workers, create opportunities for success. Now, many other countries around the world, I don't happen to know a lot about the one that you're in, they have safety nets that are simpler a lot of the times. They create a stability. They also have much more communal cultures. A lot of these places also have their own history. I know a little bit about the history of India. I know a little bit about the history of a lot of places that were colonized and how that ripples over time, how long-term structural fights between different groups continue to be things that impact where that country is today. I think it's a balance. I think we should be moving forward. I do think we should celebrate our success. It sounds like you and I both think that the things that we put in place during the COVID pandemic, the ways the government responded, led to a lot of positive outcomes. I think you and I both like the fact that more people are working in the United States than ever before, that unemployment rates are lower.
I'm concerned that it's not played out yet and that we don't know the answer. Because, for example, if U.S. stock market takes a severe hit like we saw in 2008 or like we saw in 2002, all bets are off.
You keep on holding your breath. I will be ready to celebrate the moment that we're in and be happy that inflation is coming down.
Right. But I mean, you're a student of history too, so you know what happens when markets get extended. They come down. So that's my point. We don't know where we are right now. A couple of years from now, if rates are at 4 or 5%, inflation's at 2 or 3%, the stock market's at all-time highs, you win this argument, hands down.
Okay. How many years?
I don't know, 2 or 3 years.
2 or 3 years? I'll be back in touch in 2 or 3 years. I predict at some point the stock market will go down a little bit. So much of what we did during this COVID era put Americans in a better place than they were. We can't be like, oh, the problems are horrible. I know there's really big successes, but we can't really talk about those for 2 years because the problems are horrible. It seems like you're sort of not playing on a level playing field.
I do my share of traveling. I do my share of getting around. I know, for example, in the last 5 years, American cities have changed dramatically. They've changed dramatically. It doesn't take much to look around and see how those things have changed. It's changed dramatically.
What are some of the changes?
Homelessness, drug use, stores leaving big cities, rampant crime. I'm not making things up. This is something everyone knows. I mean, you know this too.
Crime is an issue.
It's a huge issue.
It's increased over a short amount of time after many, many, many years of massive declines. After a global worldwide pandemic, after many cases, one of the things that we know is linked to increases in crime is we had a set of police killings by police of people that set off a set of protests that people are very upset about. And then that actually led to a decline in policing.
Which ones are you speaking of?
I'm thinking of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, that set off a set of protests. This is something that's been going on for our history. This is deeply linked to our history, violence against people. Our country, let's face it, you and I should both face it. Our country is a violent country.
Interesting point of George Floyd. We just recently had a killing in Memphis. So the George Floyd killing, black man killed by a white guy. In Memphis, we have a black guy killed by, I think, 4 or 5 black cops. And there's no protest. There's no anything. There's a lot of people in America that question why that is, because when it comes to, yes, we don't want cops killing anybody that they're not supposed to kill. We don't want that. No one wants that. But it also seems like we find the moment, we find the needle in the haystack, so to speak.
It's not a needle in a haystack. It's 1,000 police killings a year.
1,000 police killings a year in America?
Yeah. Look at the data from, I think it's on The Guardian. Police kill more people in a year than in other countries they do in decades.
There's 1,000 unjustified police killings per year in America?
No, there's 1,000 police killings in a year. It's very hard to say what's justified and what's not justified. That's 10 times more than in most countries.
That's pretty controversial on your part. We do generally know if they're justified or not justified, right? So there's not 1,000 unjustified police killings in America.
Well, you go ahead and look in the literature. I think you're going to find it very hard. When you outpace every other country in the world by like dozens, that's when it's time to say, maybe it's not the fault of a few individuals. Maybe that does re-embedding the racism that we have.
What countries are you comparing to?
Canada, United Kingdom. I don't think there's any country that kills its people. We don't have any country in the world that I'm aware of, at least any Western industrialized country, that kills where the police kill remotely the same amount or where we incarcerate the same amount. We are an unusual country in these ways.
You really think we're an unusual country in these ways? There's all kinds of trouble in South America. There's trouble in South Africa. There's trouble all over the planet in terms of various countries. Yeah, of course, if we look at Canada, if we look at some westernized countries, generally a homogenized population, of course, they're going to all look similar. America's not the only place with violence.
Yeah, you can definitely decide who you think we should be compared to. Nobody incarcerates as many people as we incarcerate.
But why do we incarcerate people?
That's a great question. That's a great question.
Do we incarcerate people because they're doing bad things? Do we incarcerate people because they're committing crime, committing murder? Why do we incarcerate people?
We took a policy decades ago where we said we're going to incarcerate people for things that other places don't incarcerate. We're not unusual in our level of regular crime. We are unusual in our level of violent crime. We have sowed this as a society. When you incarcerate people, it wreaks havoc on communities. It's complicated. I'm not going to say it's not complicated. There's obviously lots of people who are incarcerated that deserve to be there. As a country, we put longer sentences than others, and that's something that we should be thinking about. We've made this bed together.
I've not seen any violent crime in Vietnam in 10 years. Nothing that resembles it. This is the part that you're talking to someone who's maybe we're similar age, roughly.
Is there a long and persistent history of lynchings of a large group of people in Vietnam?
No, just when America came here and killed 4 million people.
Was there, a long and persistent history of keeping opportunity from people of color? Does Vietnam have more guns than anyone else, and it's not even close?
You make this sound like the only place in the world that has any trouble is America.
That's not what I think. It's an empirical fact that we have 400 million guns. I think the next closest has about half that amount per person.
Let me respond to your point. I find one of the most interesting things in a place like Vietnam, I could see this in China or Japan too, is everybody feels like brothers and sisters. It's pretty homogenous type places.
So maybe they don't have a long history of enslaving each other.
Oh, that's not true. Every country around the world has a history of enslaving everybody. I mean, my gosh, the African slave trade into the Middle East was outstandingly high. At sorted points in time, whites have been enslaved. There's been slavery all around.
That's somehow equivalent to what's happened in the United States over the last century and a half. Sure.
I don't understand.
The legacy of those things just rippled through the generations.
I don't understand.
Of the types of long-term historical experiences.
I'm just asking, as a matter of fact, you think that the only place that has had a legacy of slavery is America?
No, of course not.
Okay.
I was asking about guns. So are you saying that we don't have more guns than anyone else in the world? Because that would be wrong. I listed a whole set of contextual factors.
We do have guns in America. We absolutely have guns in America.
We have more guns than anyone else.
Let me finish. There's also a reason for that. I mean, I happen to know people. I have relatives that I know that have guns and safes in their house. So you have a lot of people in America that own guns for the reason that the Second Amendment was created. They don't go out and use them. And we discussed earlier in this conversation that it is 3% of the American population committing 50 to 60% of the gun homicides at a crime level, and they're killing each other. That's the part that seems a little disingenuous to me, is to say that the average Joe in the suburbs that goes to a gun show in Chantilly, Virginia, that's filled with cops and FBI agents, and they take the gun home and they put it in their gun safe. I don't see how that translates to the overwhelming gun violence that's taking place right now with the 3% of the American population that's doing 60% of the killings. That's the part that I don't understand. It seems like, okay, fair enough. If you don't like guns, I get it. That's a fair enough position.
I think there is room for nuance in this position. 380 million guns is a lot of guns.
We don't kill that many people in a country. There's only like 12,000 gun deaths a year. So we have 300 million guns and only 12,000 killings.
So you're on the record as saying 12,000 killings. That's fine. It's worth the 380 million guns.
Hold on. That's not what I said.
Oh, okay. That's what it sounded like you said.
We've already established that, look, most of the gun killing is by who? Who is most, the 50 to 60% of the gun killing in America is who?
If you want to rank the states, you would find Idaho at the top. I don't want you to beat up on Idahoans. Some of my best friends are Idaho.
I'm asking you point blank, if 50 to 60% of gun homicides are committed by who in America?
If you want to have me back on to talk about a statistic that you have that I don't, I'm happy to take a look at it.
You do not know that 3% of the American population commits 50 to 60% of the gun homicides. That statistic has held true for decades.
I have to say, I didn't know we were going to talk about gun violence, and I thought we were going to talk about my book. That's okay. I do talk about violence in the book, so I've been able to have the conversation. If you want to look at the structural causes, I've given you my view on what the answer is. We have way too many guns. We have historically, through structural racism, packed people in and reduced opportunity. We have a long-term history of violence that plays out to this very day. We're a violent nation.
Let me take it to something positive. What's the solution?
Well, I think we should have a lot more gun regulation. Here's an interesting thing. Places that have more safe gun storage, that have background checks. If you want to reduce violence, that is the clear-cut way to do it. Actually, interestingly, it reduces police violence. The best way to reduce the number of police deaths is through practical gun control measures that a majority of Americans, as I understand it, agree with. And then I think it's got to be a lot about expanding access to opportunity.
Let me address the gun part really quick. Chicago has some of the toughest gun laws in the country, and they're killing people left and right all day long.
So it's things we have to do as a nation. There's a very clear flow in of guns from other states. So that's our challenge. The borders are porous. There are certain things that states can do, and it'll have a positive impact. I would need to go back and look and see where Illinois is on state laws that allow for gun control. I would need to know that. It is true that when you're abutting other states that have very different rules, it's difficult for the rules to have the effect that we want.
Let me take it back to where you were going with opportunity. And I think this is ultimately a big picture American disagreement. A significant portion of America can see opportunity through the lens of government managed opportunity. And a significant portion of America can say, hold on, let me pull my bootstraps up and figure this out. Let me put some individual responsibility on this opportunity part. I'm going to let you comment.
I think the evidence is quite clear that providing a stable safety net can have a positive impact on opportunity in a number of ways. We also have to have trade policies and economic policies that support Americans. One of the more interesting papers that I've read in recent years is the signing and implementation of NAFTA did more to alter the political landscape. Before NAFTA, Democrats controlled the House of Representatives for something like 50 straight years. And after NAFTA, it's been sort of a toss-up. They've had it less than they've had it because Southern Democrats went away from the Democratic Party. I think part of our book suggests that we have to have a reckoning with that. I'm not a trade policy expert. I think Americans are pissed.
You said they're what?
I think they're pissed. They're angry because of the decline in jobs, and it has nothing to do with the safety net. It has to do with trade policies that have changed the terms of employment in a dramatic fashion, especially for low-skilled men.
At the beginning of this conversation, you said I should be celebrating the record low unemployment.
I do think you should be celebrating that. The types of jobs have changed. And that's kind of what I'm saying, is that people are going to work in record numbers right now. The economy has changed, and sort of that's the longer term structural issue.
Technology has changed. People have to do better in school.
Absolutely.
We've only addressed it a little bit. The education statistics across America, when you start to look at overall and then by group, that's also clearly a problem. I brought up with the Asian kids. Look, I'll share with you also really quick. I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area. The best high school in America is Thomas Jefferson High School. I think it's in Annandale or Falls Church. For 30 years, it was one of these magnet schools, merit only. So I think in 8th grade, you take the test, and if you get in, you get to go to TJ. So at the end of 30 years, Fairfax County, Virginia did not like the demographics of the TJ graduates, which were essentially 75% Asian. Now, me personally, I'm like, hell, if these kids are the ones that are studying and getting in, then let's do it. Let's go for it. Now they've changed the rules, so it's no longer based on merit because the powers that be did not like the distribution. Does that kind of effort cause you discomfort?
I think that we should have a educational system that does invest in a fairly equal way. I think we should acknowledge our history of underinvesting in schools, especially in Black communities, for a century plus. I think if we had more of a level playing field there, then rural white kids are the same way. In our book, we talk about these vast differences in the amount of money spent on schools in Eastern Kentucky compared to other parts of the state. I'm comfortable with a society where we actually have a level starting playing field. I think it can allow for more conversation about schools like that. Our history is not that. It's not just history, it's bubbled through, right? Where we have vast differences in how we invest in schools. It's not equally distributed. I think as a country, we're a lot better off if we invest in all of our kids. And we can talk about the Harvards, we can talk about the affirmative action policies have benefited white students at Harvard. Should we be reducing the number of white students? That's definitely a debate that we can have. Why don't we, as a starting place, actually invest enough in all of our kids? Let's invest in the Asian kids. Let's invest in the white kids. Let's invest in the Black kids and the Latino kids. Let's actually give everybody a chance instead of holding the hands behind people's backs.
What's interesting about what you're saying is let's invest. And I think to myself, as you say that, I think, okay, that's the government perspective. That's the big brother perspective. And I say to myself, well, what about the family perspective? What about the individual perspective? When does that play a role too? That's the part that frustrates someone like me. You've got a very provocative title. And I was sitting here prepping for our conversation. I was thinking about it. Injustice of place. And I jotted down to myself, I said, the injustice of parents, the injustice of country, meaning I happen to be in a different country right now. There's a lot of poor people. There's a lot of poverty all around the world. People that just would be dying to come to America. The injustice of IQ, the injustice of genes. You have a different genetic fiber than me. That might not be fair to me. That's the part that frustrates me, is that sometimes I feel like, gosh, life isn't fair. We've not done a very good job of making anything fair. And I don't know if fair is even possible. But we have spent in America a lot of money and a lot of time. And I look at some of the education statistics that come out of our larger cities today, and I just shake my head and I say, gosh, it's worse than before LBJ.
I actually think you're wrong on that too. I think there has been progress that's made. Graduation rates are vastly more than they were. I believe that test scores have increased for every group. That's not to say that we don't have huge inequalities, but I think that's another one where all of this stuff has to have nuance. All of this stuff, we have to weigh the places where we've had success and where we have challenges. I believe that we have seen improvements over time, but it's also true that we have a long and persistent history of holding people back. Look, when you can find the same places, the communities that we write about in the book are the same places that were extremely poor half a century ago, and they're the same places that had all of these policies of enforced segregation, of redlining, of lynchings a century ago. Dependent on the parents, even people who want to pin on the parents say, you know what, if your course was predetermined by where we were a century ago, maybe we should be looking a little bit more broadly. Let's talk about Eastern Kentucky for a minute. In the schools, there's a lot of people who say exactly what you say, that kids, they don't want to do well. They're trying to get public benefits. We were really interested to find out that some of the schools in Eastern Kentucky also were being taken over by the state for massive corruption. I think that's a place where maybe we should pause before we throw blame at the poor kids and their parents to say, maybe we should think a little bit about how in society we've let these school districts abscond with a lot of the money.
Let me share a response. I know recently I looked at statistics for Baltimore and Chicago. There was literally, no exaggeration, 0 students that were at grade level in the high school levels of all of Baltimore, all of Chicago. I'm sure that wasn't the case in the 60s.
I don't think we had grade level. SAT scores have gone up. I think literacy scores are better. I think there's been a lot of improvements since the 60s. We just weren't looking back then.
Here's where I'm ultimately driving at. When do you raise the flag and say, we've got there? I've got a relative who's a junior at a Virginia college. I've got another relative who is a freshman at a Virginia college. I've seen what's being taught in colleges these days. Very different than what I was taught, 80s and early 90s, very different. I wonder how much longer do kids today, 20-year-old kid today, do they have to imagine having these same conversations at the same kind of level 50 years from now? I don't see the hope. That's what I'm getting at. I see more decline than I see hope.
Yeah. I mean, I also walked uphill to school both ways when I was a kid. I think my parents also felt the same way. I think there's got to be this balance between seeing the challenges and the problems that we have and not having rose-colored glasses for a time. I think about parents with daughters, and the economic opportunities for parents with daughters are fundamentally different. That daughter can talk about meritocracy. We know across a lot of colleges that half a century ago, women were in colleges and graduate school programs in very, very low numbers. And now, if it was a meritocracy, then it'd be usually more than 60-40. I think by your definition, that is progress. And I agree. We can get trapped into these narratives. I think it's important to try to recognize the things that have improved over time. I do agree with you that Americans they feel less stable. They would like jobs that they can depend on. They'd like jobs that have a career track. I think you and I probably agree on those things. We have this sort of long-term blaming that on welfare.
I'm lifelong entrepreneur.
Oh, okay. You may not like that, but that's what most Americans want.
Well, what they want and what is realistic is also another issue. We can all dream for something that's might not coming back. I mean, look, you and I both know when it comes to, you brought up manufacturing, that's not coming back. And if it does come back, for example, everyone loves their iPhone, but do they love their iPhone when it costs $4,000? That's the issue.
I think it's something we should have a serious conversation about in a lot of rural communities. I think the specter of inflation, right, is also, I think, the biggest driver, according to the evidence, is the breakdown of international supply chains. I don't know if it's possible. I do think it's something that we should be listening to the policymakers who do want to bring things back and see if we have any plans that could actually make that possible. I don't think it's ever going to be like it was in the 40s or the 50s when the rest of the world was decimated and we had already invested with the government in a war apparatus that could be transformed into manufacturing hub of the world. I think we could be doing better. I think we could have more manufacturing jobs than we have. And it's going to look different, but I think we can do better.
Do you imagine, this is what I would imagine, people listening to this conversation, they would think that this is a conversation between the typical two halves of the political debate in America. They would argue that you have argued the blue side and I have argued the red side. I think the vast majority of people would agree with that. Can you see that?
Well, I don't know if you're typical for the red side.
What do you think's atypical about me?
I mean, maybe that's something I shouldn't comment on.
You're not going to insult me, I don't think. An interesting point about modern America is that we're not allowed to talk about what everyone's talking about behind the scenes.
I hope at least whatever else your listeners think, they will think that you and I covered a lot of ground and had a real set of debates, and we'll appreciate that.
And that was my point. My point is I think most people would listen to us and they would say, okay, here's the current American blue side and here's the current American red side. And then they're going to say, I'm not saying you and I can't agree or disagree or whatever. I think people listening would say, that sounds like the two sides that are never going to find a place to agree on. That's what I think most people would say.
I guess so. I bet if you polled your listeners, the majority of them would agree with me that we should work really hard to bring more manufacturing jobs back to the United States. And I bet if you polled your listeners, they would say, you know what, we probably should fund schools at a pretty equal level. Maybe not. I could be wrong. I think there is an American ethos that says, you know what, let's make smart investments that are going to pay off in the long run. I do think that most Americans think we should have common sense gun control.
Most Americans do have common sense gun control because they're not killing each other. There is one particular group that does kill each other a lot. There is common sense gun control and it's individual. It's not legal, meaning people realize if I pull this thing out and I kill someone, it's bad. People understand that on an individual, personal level. Some people in America clearly don't care, and that's reflected in the crime stats.
Well, there's a lot loaded into that statement.
Not really.
I think we've already covered today, and I've given you my views on that stuff.
Again, like I said, I think this is where America is. America, I think people listening would say, and that's the part that frustrates me. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to have you on, is I realized, well, okay, we might come at this from different perspectives. I'm going to push you. I'm going to be a skeptic. I'm going to get you to try to justify perspectives. But I find it's hard. It's hard. I feel there's a little bit of you sometimes that maybe you feel insulted or you feel like, oh, I don't want to address what he's saying.
I spent a whole hour with you. I think I gave you my views on every single one of the things that you wanted to talk about. I had very little to do with my book, which is what I thought I was coming on to talk about in the first place. I don't think it's fair to characterize me in that way. And also, I think if we read through the transcript, you'll find I tried to identify a number of places where I thought there was some agreement. I also happen to think you are quite wrong on a number of things, but that's America, right? This is an American exercise that we have fundamentally different views of the world.
That's my point, is that I think that there is this fundamental disagreement in America. Look, I'm a nice guy. I can be a nice guy. Well, you and I could go have a beer, whatever. I do think there is this fundamental disagreement. And when those issues get on the table and we start to ask questions and make comparisons, everybody just goes crazy. I'm not saying you went crazy, okay? But I'm saying everyone just gets hot under the collar, where it's like, I think that's just the part where it's like, hey, why can't we put everything on the table and have the conversation? That's the part that frustrates me. That's why I wanted to have you on. Look,
Well, maybe you can finish by saying thank you for coming and talking with me for an entire hour about this stuff.
I mean, I hope it didn't frustrate you. I mean, I think it was a good back and forth.
Yeah, I fundamentally disagree with many of the positions that you take, but we did have a good back and forth. You're right to think those things.
The book, Injustice of Place, Uncovering the Legacy of Poverty in America. Luke, where would you like to send people to check you out?
You're the first podcast to talk about it.
You're praying you're going to have easier podcast interviews.
You can pre-order it at your favorite bookstore or go to Amazon.
Is there a website you want to direct people to?
We don't have a website up.
But if people wanted to reach out to you, they can find you at the University of Michigan.
Very easy to find me. Yep, absolutely.
Luke, I appreciate you coming on.
I'm glad to be here. Take care, Michael.
A little epilogue today. This conversation indeed was started to discuss poverty in America. That is why at the very beginning I brought up the LBJ Great Society programs from the 1960s. However, once I brought that up, the idea being, hey, we spent all this money, and where are we all these years later? My guest today said that the Great Society was a good thing and worked. And then he brought it up to modern times and said, right now, the economy is great, record unemployment. Of course, I'm going to challenge these types of things. I'm going to dig into the details. I would have had this conversation go on for hours and hours to get to the bottom of issues. So we weren't talking past each other, and we had to put everything on the table. For example, my guest today brought up gun violence. Okay, who's committing the gun crimes in America? Who's committing the gun violence in America? It's not just everyone. My guest said something about Idaho several times. I've looked at the gun stats of Idaho. There is nothing special about Idaho. Idaho is a small state with a relatively small number of gun-related deaths. The vast majority of those are suicides. When it comes to crime and violence, Idaho is not the conversation about gun violence in America. It's just not. It's a misdirection. I'm sorry, it is. That's fine. Everybody's got their perspective. Everybody's got their angle. Everybody can put everything on the table, and I would have kept this conversation going. But look, if anyone comes on this podcast and they put things on the table and they say things, it doesn't go unchallenged. If I have an understanding or I have a perspective that's different, and I can show that it's different, and I can bring up issues, and I can bring up facts, and I can bring up statistics to show that there is a different perspective, perhaps the correct perspective, I'm going to do that every time. It's unfortunate that my guest thinks this conversation today was not about poverty. Look, all these issues are connected. And at the end of the day, like I said in this conversation, there are 2 points of view. We can attempt to trust only the government to solve all of these problems, or we can do things ourselves. This is it. Around the world, this is the attitude. And ultimately, my personal perspective is I'm trusting myself, period. I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.